Welcome back to our series on career counseling. Today's topic will be work adjustment theory. This is one of the more important approaches within what we may broadly call the trait and factor approach to career counseling. Hugely influential, perhaps not practiced in its pure form by all that many practitioners, but again, with great influence on really all of us. So here we go. Work adjustment theory. First, a brief word about the founders of the approach. Here they are, these two gentlemen, Lofquist and Dawis. Lloyd Lofquist was a fairly standard issue academic, I suppose, in some ways. He grew up in Minnesota, only left for some military service during the Second World War, came back to Minnesota, served in his alma mater, the university, for over 40 years. And, bless him. The other founder has a little more unusual of a life history. He came to the U of Minnesota from the Philippines as a graduate student, and then again remained there essentially forever. And in fact, as of this broadcast being recorded, which is in 2022, he's still around and still somewhat active to the best of my knowledge, which you have to give men a lot of credit there. So there they are. Now, both of them started out as advisees of Donald Peterson, who was one of the real creators of what's sometimes called applied psychology, which includes so-called vocational psychology as a subset, yada, yada. And he was in a time frame in the 1950s when the client-centered Rogerian approach was becoming increasingly influential in the counseling world. Peterson was one of the people who really pushed back against that, advocating for a more actuarial approach where you would, test them, see what the psychometrics showed, and then let them know, test them and tell them, as they sometimes say. And the whole work adjustment approach kind of flows out of that tradition as well. So what are we looking at? Well, to start with, these two gents ran a long-standing research project funded by the US government, the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, 16 years of continuous funding, followed by many years more of work at the university itself. And what they were trying to do here was not simply to develop, say, a single psychological test or a three-session model for counseling as such, but they wanted to embed this all in a generalized theory of work adjustment and make it easier for counselors to facilitate clients' wishes, to be matched up with occupations that would be suitable for them. Okay. So, there's a lot of stuff that came out of this. You don't get government funding for a better part of 20 years and produce nothing. Most of this work is available, by the way, on the internet. If you search, you'll find it at a University of Minnesota site. So there were, book-length monographs, many journal articles, actual, bound books, the test, the Minnesota Importance Questionnaire, et cetera, et cetera. And they also trained lots and lots of graduate students who went on to become career counselors, guidance counselors, and of course, future researchers in the field as well. So what's the theory say? Now, I'm going to give you a simplified form. It did naturally grow more complex over time, but the ABCs remained about the same here. What we're trying to predict is tenure, which is to say, how long are you going to stay in the occupation? Or more precisely, will you still be working in this occupation after this much time has passed, 5 years or 10 years, whatever the study is utilizing as the interval. Are you going to still be there, still doing that kind of work? Now, they argued there are two key predictors here, two important predictors. Neither one's going to be a huge surprise, I don't think. The first one is satisfaction, like in job satisfaction. So the question here is, does this work meet your needs, meet your wishes? Are the rewards of the work compatible with what you're looking for in life? And so the way they're going to get at this, in turn, is by looking at the goodness of fit, as it were, between the reinforcers available in the occupation and what you find important. And we're going to unpack all of this as we move along. The second key predictor would be satisfactoriness. So satisfaction has to do with, do you like it, right? Satisfactoriness has to do more with, well, do they like you? Are you any good at this from the standpoint of those who are hiring you, employing you? So, can you fulfill the expectations of the work? And again, to predict satisfactoriness, what you would look for is some measure of the goodness of fit between your abilities, what you're actually competent to do on the one hand, and the task demands of the work on the other hand. Very sensible model, actually, very sensible model. And you can map it out like this. So you have the correspondence of the reinforcers to your values, predicting satisfaction, which predicts in turn whether you're going to stay or quit, and you have the correspondence level between your abilities and what's expected of you, leading to satisfactoriness, leading to whether you are kept on or let go. Notice there is some interaction effect expected between satisfaction and satisfactoriness. To some extent, if you're good at it, you're probably going to start to like it a bit better than if you're not good at it. And conversely, if you like what you're doing, you're probably going to put more effort into becoming good at it. So they're theoretically independent of each other, but they do interface, they do interact to some extent. And of course, at the output end, there's the question, the probability of your remaining in the occupation, however many years down the road we're talking about. And again, in a nutshell, that's the whole theory right there. So we have two tasks we need to perform, one of which we need to perform with each and every client, and that is the matching of values with reinforcers to predict satisfaction. Direct quote here, satisfaction is a function of the correspondence between the reinforcer system of the work environment and the individual's set of needs. In other words, is it giving you what you want? To what extent, rather, is it giving you what you want? It boils down to. So again, if your needs are not being met, you're not being adequately reinforced for your efforts, you're likely to leave the field, even if you might be pretty good at it. Of course, if the reinforcers are adequate, then you're likely to want to remain. So then the key variable is going to be whether you are also performing appropriately, in a satisfactory fashion, that is. So we got to measure values. And this is going to be something we have to do with each individual client once we have a values measure in place. Now, values are an interesting set of concepts in counseling and psychology. What the term refers to here are what you perceive as being motivating or reinforcing. So something can have a strong positive value, you're finding it very reinforcing to engage in work activities that would get you that. Something else might be moderately or mildly reinforcing, and some things might even have a negative valence where you would actually prefer not to go there, so they would be ranked very low. Mind you, the word values in the English language can be used in different ways. Here, we are not using values to refer to moral values as such. If the word can be used that way, that's not what we're doing. Now, that doesn't mean that you might not set a value on living up to a moral code, and that could vary a great deal, from people who are extremely moral in their behavior, or at least try to be, all the way to people who don't give a hoot, how many rules they break and who they hurt. But that's not primary. But again, that would be one value in this more psychological sense of the term. So what you have to think of is like, how much would you value having a new car? How much do you value having a night out on the town once a week? How much do you value, winning a trophy at a competitive event, and so forth and so on? Now, when we are asking the question, how much value do you set on this outcome, whatever it might be, usually we're talking about values that you can tell me about. So these are more or less consciously held or self-attributed values, and we're typically measuring them using self-report inventories of one sort or another. That's not necessarily the only set of motivators out there, but that's what we're going to be digging into in the work adjustment theory world at any rate. And so does most research into values. Now, a very important issue to keep in mind here is that values can only be measured relative to one another. if I ask, if you were in front of me and I could ask for a show of hands, how many of you would like to have a job that pays well? Virtually every hand will go up. How many of you would like to have a job where you can feel good about what you're doing for humanity? And just about every hand goes up. How many of you, would like to have pleasant coworkers and a pleasant work environment? And just about every hand goes up. You see the problem. If you just say, do you want this? People are going to be like, yep. There might be a couple of no's in there, but not many. So what you have to do is to pit reinforcers against one another and make it a relative thing. So you tend to use what are known as one form or another of forced choice inventories. Would you rather have the opportunity to be promoted and win higher status, or work with pleasant people in a mutually supportive environment? And you can only have one. Which one do you pick? And that's how values inventories tend to be constructed, which is sometimes a little frustrating for the person filling them out, but it's the only way to get at what you're after, frankly. So you have to imagine, if I had to choose, which would I choose? Now, the folks at Work Adjustment Project put together the Minnesota Importance Questionnaire, or MIQ for short. They did develop two separate forms of this. I don't want to get too far into the weeds on it, but the original form, I believe, was the paired form. And that's, again, a straight up forced choice. So you have two statements and you're picking one or the other. Do you want to be able to get ahead or work with friendly people, for example? And so you have to have quite a few items, because you have to compare, every possible permutation of the different value statements you have. It's very easy to do this because you're just choosing between two things, but the test can take 30, 40 minutes for a client to complete. So they did later develop a so-called ranked form. And here, each item actually contains 5 of these statements, 5 items, different values being expressed. And what you're supposed to do is rank order them from the most important to the least. This can be completed in just over half the time, which is a signal advantage. But there will be some clients who find it a bit more difficult. I do believe that with the advent of click and drag systems on computers, that sort of thing has gotten easier, but it is a little more challenging, perhaps cognitively. These are well-developed instruments. The reliability, internal consistency, measured by Cronbach's alpha, I think, is typically around 0.8. And if you come back and retest people 10 months later, there have been several studies of that kind, but the profiles tend to have about a 0.85 to 0.9 reliability, retest reliability, which is quite high. So these are well-developed, well-constructed instruments. Here's the underlying structure of the MIQ. I won't necessarily go into every detail here, but let's look at a bit of it. First off, you're going to look at 6, what you might think of as higher order values. And these were identified, developed through multivariate statistical technique known as factor analysis that we didn't concern ourselves with. So there's one cluster of values collectively referred to as achievement, another as comfort, another as status, another is altruism, another is safety, and lastly, we have autonomy. Quite a set of values, right? And again, they probably all look pretty good. The question is, which of these are more important to you and which are less important? And the way it's constructed, because it's a forced choice measure, there tend to be pairs that are negatively correlated. So achievement and comfort are kind of at opposite ends. Status and altruism are kind of at opposite ends. So if you want to be a Wall Street arbitrageur, your values are very different from those of someone who wants to be a kindergarten teacher. Then those actually will be negatively related. And safety and autonomy, likewise, the more freedom you want, the less protection, safety you're going to have. So you have, in a way, 3 pairs here. Now, each of these is actually a composite made up of 2 or more kind of lower level needs or values. There are 20 of these altogether. So under achievement, we have 2 first order values, as it were, the ability to do what you're good at, utilize your talents and really feel like you're doing that, and the core achievement need of feeling like, this is actually important work. I'm getting something important done here. Comfort also can be, again, broken down into subunits. There's, keeping busy so you're not bored. There's working alone, so you don't have to have other people in your face. There's having some variety, so it's not all about routine. And there's compensation, being well paid for what you do. It's kind of a funny cluster, but statistically they kind of hung together. So they did get put together that way. And lastly, I think under this one, I think it's the last, security, job security. So are you well paid? Do you have steady work? Do you have, a work environment where you're being kept busy and you have some variety? And oh yes, the working conditions one. Is it a pleasant environment, a non-toxic environment? Yeah, that's comfort. Then you've got status, and here we've got a few subsets again. Do you have a chance to get ahead? Can you advance in the field? Can you become someone who's known and recognized in the field? That people are like, ooh, there goes so-and-so, they're good at such and such. Do you get authority where you can tell people what to do? And do you develop a kind of social status outside of your occupation itself, where you might be considered to be an important or high status person in the town or city where you live? And then there's altruism. Again, this is, the opposite side here. What are your coworkers like? Are they, nice people, easy to get along with? Do you get to do good for the world, good for other people, as opposed to things that violate your moral code? So that's where that kind of values comes into play. Are you, doing something good for the community, helping, social, providing social services? Those are the three components. And then the last pairing, of course, will be that of safety versus autonomy. So under safety, does your company or agency have fair, consistent policies in place that are fundamentally benign? Does management generally treat people well? Is the human relations pattern with your supervisors positive one? And on a technical level, is the supervision, what is it really teaching you what to do? Are the training programs good? Or, are they there to help you when you need help figuring out how to get something done? Autonomy, by contrast, involves things like creativity. Do you get to try out your own ideas? And responsibility. Do you get to make your own decisions? So for example, someone in education, do you create your own course content and syllabi and make those decisions for yourself? Or are you handed a kind of canned package and told, this is the curriculum, follow that curriculum, right? Someone with high autonomy needs would vastly prefer not to be handed a canned curriculum. Whereas on the other hand, someone with strong safety needs might actually like that, because it's like, okay, they're training me in what to do. I don't have to, make all my own decisions here. Okay, so I mentioned the MIQ. We've gone into the MIQ in some depth. There are potential problems here, so let's dig into this. So, two big disadvantages to the MIQ. First, and this is a minor one, they did charge a fee for scoring. It was, computer scoring. This thing, remember, was developed originally way back in like the 70s. So the computers were these, giant things, probably with like gears still, I'm not sure. It wasn't terribly expensive, but you did have to send your stuff in to get it scored. Much more importantly, it's really hasn't been updated in forever. So if you use the MIQ, which you can, the trouble is it would be very hard to get it scored. I'm not even sure they will still do that if you ask them. But enhanced scoring would be nightmarish. Let's just put it that way. But it's just way out of date. So luckily, though, the team at ONET, and this is a government-funded unit, very relevant to career counseling, it comes up in many of these presentations, has developed a values measure modeled after the MIQ, very, very similar to it, where you have 5 or 6 needs. I think it is still 6 needs. I may have messed up there, broken into 21 clusters. So again, very similar. And this was taxpayer funded. It was government sponsored work. So the inventory is available free of charge. Yay. You can download materials for the paper and pencil version. I think they have 2 different names for it. The paper and pencil might be called the Work Importance Locator, whereas the computer-based one is the Work Importance Profiler. But in any case, some career counseling services have, created or made available online self-scoring versions. And one of these we will be taking a peek at in a moment. So just looking at them side by side, the higher level values are effectively the same. Some of them have been renamed. So status became recognition, altruism became relationships, comfort became working conditions, et cetera. But they are definitionally the same. There's one extra need in there, go figure. They may have even done that for psychometric purposes, but I'm not sure. But it's basically almost an identical measure and completely compatible with for anyone wanting to work within the work adjustment theory framework. So if you're interested in it, one place where you can take it, again, free of charge, is at this website. It's the state of Pennsylvania has a career zone set up as a nonprofit, funded however, and you would do so. Now, we will have a quick peek at that website in a moment, but if you go there, you can complete whichever it's called, the profiler or the locator. I always get mixed up which is paper and pencil, which is computer. Importantly, it's not going to save your stuff for you, I think, unless you're registered with them, and if you're not in Pennsylvania, why? So be sure to write down your results. And very importantly, when you get to the end and they have your basic results, those are just going to be the big 6 needs, big 6 values. And there's a little button you can click saying detailed needs. Click that because that will give you your actual scores on all of the 21 underlying values. And you actually do want that information because you will find sometimes that there's a particular value that's relatively low, but one of the lower level values in it is actually pretty high. And so you get a lot more information. Just, if you forget to do that, and then you're like, oh, nuts, I really would like to look at them, you're just going to have to go in and take the whole thing again. Again, it doesn't take too long, 20 minutes or so, but be aware of that. So whatever you're getting, when you have all those scores, either write them down the old-fashioned way or save them with a screenshot and keep the file. And remember, until you're sure you got it all, don't close the tab, don't go away. So let's have a quick peek. We're not going to stay there and do the whole thing, but just to give you a sense of what this looks like, we're going to go to within slideshow, this is not going to work. So hold on. I'm going to have to escape from the slideshow. Sorry, this is a little clumsy, isn't it? Scroll back down to where we are. Boom. And we'll go in. There we go. Okay, so this is what it looks like. Again, it's the Pennsylvania Career Zone. And so they tell you, you're about to take it. It is the profiler. And you just, click next. I'll go through the first couple of pages with you. You click on a question to select it. And you can use the arrow buttons on the right to move it up or down by dragging. So here, we'll see how this looks. You can read this in detail, and any client of yours you would need to make sure understood what was coming up as well. So if you look at where we go, oh yes, of course, no right or wrong answers, just trying to find out what's important, and there's no time limit, et cetera, et cetera. So here's the first of 21 rounds. And again, you can probably do this whole thing in 20 minutes or less, as long as you don't agonize over it. But here are 5 different sorts of values. Each one is related to one of the 21 values on the test. So if you could say, well, gee, I'd like to try out my own ideas, see I can do it there, or I could do it here and just use the arrow, boom, and I went up, and I could say, well, no, not so important. And oops, not there. Can't do anything there and there. So you see, now I've ranked them saying most important, try out my own ideas. Next, I'd like to do things for other people. I'm not as concerned about pay. And if I have to have some downtime, so be it. And I would then proceed to the next item on the list. And again, for my ideal job, dot, 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 dot. And you do the 21 rounds. And I believe at the end, there's a single page where you have just yes, no statements about the different values. And it doesn't look important to you. Okay, so that's it. Now, just a few things to think about. And if you're having a class discussion, you might find that these are topics worth discussing. How could this be helpful? We're essentially helping people to clarify their values and what is and is not important to them in terms of what they're going to be able to get out of their work. Notice how this is different, by the way, than the measurement of interests, which we cover in other sessions. You also might wonder, since this is all self-report, it's all stuff I'm aware of, is there anything more unconscious? Are there so-called implicit needs as opposed to explicit ones that might come into play? And there might well be. The self-report measures aren't going to get us there. So how could they factor into the counseling? And are there some ways we might try to get at those too? Worth considering. Not something that the Lofquist and Dawis were interested in, by the way. And you also could wonder, if you go through that list of values, you could ask, is there anything that might be important to some people that just aren't in their list? And I do think they did a pretty good job here, but it's worth looking at and asking, is there something important that they missed for whatever reason? Maybe, one guy from Minnesota, one guy from the Philippines working in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, didn't have a handle on the whole universe forever, maybe. Okay, now that's the values piece for you, but then the question is, what do we match that with? What do we correlate it with? Which means that the developers of the model had to come up with what they called occupational reinforcement patterns. So what they did was to develop a kind of questionnaire describing job, occupations, what jobs in an occupation would be like, and what you would get for it and need to do and all that sort of thing. And they circulated, this questionnaire to many employers. And, the question would start with things like, workers in this field get to, have high job security. Workers in this field get to exercise creativity. And the employers were rating how true each of these statements were of people in that occupation, in their experience. And the results for lots of different employers within the same occupation would get averaged out, and you'd have a pattern, right? That the employers in this field agree that people in this field are likely to get these things, less likely to get these things, and much less likely to get these other things. So what reinforcers are available? And so these would be the occupational reinforcement patterns, you see, and they would be matched up with those values. So to what extent would your safety needs be met? To what extent would your autonomy needs be met? And so forth and so on. So now you have a kind of profile of the occupation, which can stay there. And when you have a client and they have their profile of their values, their needs, you can ask, how strongly correlated are the two? Very clever stuff, right? And the general rule is, with the ONET work importance profiler anyhow, if you get correlations of 0.4 and above, that's like a standard Pearson product moment correlation coefficient, by the way, that would be an excellent match. If the correlations are in the 30s, 0.3 to 0.39, that's a good match, right? And below that, it's starting to look a little shaky, that what you're looking for to a large extent is not being offered to people in that occupation. And there's always that important question, are you getting what you want out of the occupation, out of your work? If you're looking for credit and you're in a position where you're not going to get any credit, you're going to be this bitter guy, right? Freaking out the kids at career day in the elementary school. All right, now that's all satisfaction. What are the occupational reinforcement patterns? What is the general structure of values? how do your values look? How do they match up with all the different occupations in the database? And by the way, if you are doing that work importance profiler, again, don't leave it right away. If you click the right button at the end, it's actually going to show you how closely your pattern of values matches many occupations, and it's going to kind of rank order them. So you'll get like, here are the really good fits in terms of the reinforcements available. It's pretty cool. Huh? All free of charge now. I mean, free. We paid for it with taxpayer dollars back in 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, but it's there. Okay. Part two, of course, is satisfactoriness. Now, for the most part, practicing career counselors are not going to follow the detailed procedures that were being utilized in the development of work adjustment theory here, but we should cover them. So again, a direct quote from their work, satisfactoriness is a function of the correspondence between an individual's set of abilities and the ability requirements of the work environment. Yeah, are you any good at it? That's what it boils down to. Because if you're not good at it, if your abilities just aren't there, you're liable to find yourself not succeeding, forced out of the occupation altogether. On the other hand, if your abilities are adequate, then the key variable is going to become satisfaction. Like, yeah, I'm good at that, but do I really want to do it, right? Am I getting out of it what I want to get out of my work life? Somebody, for example, who had a set of very high value on things like high pay and advancement in status might decide they didn't want to be a kindergarten teacher, even though they had very good skills along those lines, because they're not going to get paid a whole lot. They're not going to get a lot of promotions, and people aren't going to all be going, ooh, ah, as they walk by down the street, and kind of swagger their weight around. So they're more likely to go to Wall Street or something. I don't know. So what you need in order to make this work research-wise and as well as clinically are measures of your individual abilities and the ability requirements. For individual abilities, the Lofquist and Dawis just used an existing measure, the General Aptitude Test Battery, covered in a different presentation. It's a product of the U.S. Employment Service, first came out immediately in the post-World War II era, been through a couple of revisions since then. Again, we'll look at it more in depth another time. Originally, it included a total of 9 subtests, although 4, 5, 6, 8, whoops, 9, although sometimes a couple of those would be omitted. But, verbal, numerical, spatial abilities, coordination, dexterity, and so forth. The other half of this, and so of course, by the way, if you were practicing this in the classical way, then your client is not only completing a values inventory, they're also completing the ability test, and you're doing 2 sets of matching, right? Matching their values with the reinforcers, and then matching their abilities with the occupational aptitude patterns. These were researched by the Department of Labor, who, sent out surveys similar to the one Minnesota folks used for values, asking, okay, workers in this field need to be able to do what? And they would average out the extent to which, employers were saying yes, answering in the affirmative, to put together a pattern of, just what aptitudes you needed, what abilities you needed in order to be likely to succeed here. And then these, in turn, can be mapped for the individual client onto or correlated with the abilities that you have displayed when you took the GATB. And it's pretty much of a threshold model here that, if you cross the line and you're good enough at the stuff you need to be good enough at, it's going to come across as a good fit. I think good and excellent are 2 levels you can get here. And, you will get stronger correlations as you're better and better fit, but they're going to say you're a good fit above a certain level. So, when your employer has certain objectives in mind, whether they've told you about them or not, the question is, are you able to meet those objectives? And of course, here you have a somewhat daft employer who's not even really clear of what they are himself. So the employee simply says, oh, I'm doing it, and he's going to be okay. So what does counseling look like in this model? It looks fairly nuts and boltsy, frankly. There will be an assessment, a bit of an interview, of course, can't not interview them, but definitely testing with the MIQ, or perhaps nowadays the Work Importance Profiler, maybe with the GATB or its descendant, the Ability Profiler. And if you don't do the second piece of testing, you could have a person do a self-assessment, so like you could simply say, oh, here are different abilities, rank where you think you fall in the population. You have to kind of trust their judgment if you do that. Or you could evaluate their educational credentials and, and see how far they went in school, how well did they do, that sort of thing, and make your own estimate of what they're likely to be capable of. Those are both fraught, mind you, because they could be way off in their self-estimate, and their history might or might not actually match up with what they're good at, but it's better than nothing. And so you've done that, fancy testing, and have the computer score it. Again, in theory, you could hand score all these things, but you will need the computer to do the matching up, the correlation with all the different occupations. And yeah, they were computer scoring this again way back in the 70s when it was literally stacks of punch cards. Today, look, it's online. It's not that hard. In fact, it's almost breathtakingly easy. Now, what's going to happen then? You met with them to ask, who they are, what's going on, what do they think, yada, 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 take a background history and all that. You had them take the test or tests, reviewed the results, and now you're going to meet with them for the feedback session. And it shouldn't really be the old pejorative testamentum, yes, you should be either, an actuary or a dolphin trainer, something crazy like that. You're supposed to use your counseling skills here, right? So it should be an interactive process, seeing what they think about different stages of it, be realistically supportive if they're leaning in certain directions, as long as those aren't, horribly out of line with what they're capable of, or reflecting a terrible misunderstanding of the nature of an occupation. Be supportive. If there is a problem like that, don't challenge them directly and say, no, that's not going to work for you. For one thing, what if they do it and succeed, and then you're an idiot forever? But what you could do is say, I think you want to look at this carefully. There might be some issues here, and you get them to look into it themselves. And all you can do is point the way. And you do get these lovely little computer reports, the matches with the reinforcement patterns and the ability patterns and all that. Again, the Minnesota database is way out of date. So even if they are still making it available, I would say use the ONET system instead. It's right there. Go ahead and do it. Now, all of this said, yes, it's supposed to be interactive, not directive. It still is going to have a bit of a directive feel to it. But what you're trying to do is to help them to achieve a higher level of self-awareness, self-reflection. What are the implications of my preferred reinforcers? What are the implications of my ability, strengths, and vulnerabilities? Again, if you're confrontational, they're just going to push back against you. It's a self-defeating process. If you have concerns, again, get them to explore more fully, fall back on motivational interviewing strategies if you know how to do that. But just, don't be the horrible counselor who told somebody 30 years ago they would never go to college, and now they're standing up with their doctorate in school psychology, doing a talk at the American Psychological Association. I've been at that talk, and you wouldn't want to have been that guy's guidance counselor, back in high school if you found out about it. So, the hope is that, yeah, we will think of something for you. Let's hope. Now, so the bottom line, look, you have here a relatively simple and very clear, coherent theoretical model for vocational psychology. You have well-designed assessment procedures that are clearly keyed to the theory. And you have an approach that can be done in an expeditious way. It's an economical way. You don't need more than 3 or so sessions to do this. So what if you have limited resources to provide professional counseling? Well, if you can only provide 3 or 4 sessions, then don't launch into something that's going to take 20 sessions to complete. And lastly, there's solid research here, man. These guys did the job right. So, the validity of the tests is well established. The outcomes of the counseling have been well established, et cetera. One of the obvious limitations is that this could get really rigid and directive. If you really love counseling with more the psychotherapy side, the Rogerian stuff and all that, it's not terribly compatible with that, frankly. It's a much more, again, I think I said before, nuts and boltsy sort of way, problem solving way. And there also, of course, is this problem of the need to update the occupational information regularly. ONET is on that to some degree, so we're not hopelessly lost here. But as the pace of change accelerates in terms of what occupations are there and what people do in those occupations, this sort of updating is going to be needed, on a pretty regular basis. All of that being said, we are there. We've done it. So I'm going to say good day, and we'll see you another time.